Hey everyone, welcome to this Designlab workshop. Kieran's waving at you. My name's Andrew. I work for Designlab as a content writer and curriculum writer. Kieran is one of our awesome mentors, and he'll introduce himself in just a moment. But before we get started, I just want to say welcome, thanks for joining, and also just give you a bit of an introduction to this platform. So you'll see we're not in the regular Designlab platform, we're in Livestorm. And during the session, you have the option of chatting. You're welcome to chat, post anything related to the session in there. Feel free to just introduce yourself in the chat now if you want to, and tell us where you're joining from. Maybe what course you're taking and stuff like that. But also during the session, at any time, you can post your questions in the question tab. And if you can aim to put the questions in that tab rather than in the chat, then that means other people will be able to upvote your question if they're interested in hearing the answer to it. But yeah, I think that's all I had to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kieran, who will introduce himself, take us through an awesome slide deck, and then we'll open up to questions at the end.
Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name is Kieran. So what I want to sort of do is introduce myself a little bit first. As you can probably tell, I am from Australia, and here's some memes to prove it. There's a whole bunch of stuff that you need to know about Australia, and a lot of them can be said in some of these memes. Everything does try to kill you. We do have a lot of fires going at the moment, and that is an actual real shot of a fire NATO coming at people. And yeah, some of the biggest spiders are actually the least harmful. So the ones that look like straight out of a horror film are actually quite friendly, and you actually want to keep them around because they eat the little tiny ones that are about the size of a match stick, and they will kill you. And yeah, it's not fun. So a little bit more about who I am as a designer. I love design tooling. I love teaching, and I love Pokemon. I've been a designer for about 10 years. I've worked all kinds of different things like remote, in-house, big companies, small companies, all that kind of stuff. And I've also been working for startups and all that kind of stuff as well. But the way that I sort of want to structure this is talk a little bit about my past my past work, how I got into design and sort of my journey through design, as well as my present, what I currently do, as well as how I sort of see my future as well as the future of UX. So let's get started with the past. So this is sort of my timeline that I sort of had throughout my career. I started in 2007. I started off being a university student. I went to university here in Australia on the Gold Coast, and I got 2 bachelor degrees out of that. And what those were a bachelor in IT, majoring in marketing and management, IT marketing and IT management, and then a bachelor in multimedia, majoring in graphic design. What you'll first notice is neither of those have anything to do with UX. They are very, very tangentially related to UX. And that's kind of the point of this talk. My first job, as you can sort of see, there's a little bit of an overlap in there. And that sort of, I worked for a company called Local Search, which was a phone directory company primarily. And secondarily, I helped them out with working through going from a print age to a digital age. So I helped make them websites and bring them into the 21st century. And I worked there for 6 years. And for a lot of people, that's a very long time. And for me, it was a very long time. But what it allowed me to do is actually level up throughout that. So I'll get into that a little bit in a minute, but it allowed me to essentially work on my skills as I was on the job. Then I worked remotely for a bit between 2016 and 2017. Worked for myself, worked contract, worked for companies overseas, worked here in Australia, worked remotely for US companies. And then I also after that, I started working for a company called Auto Guru, which is a startup, which allowed me to work with a small team and then use my design skills to push a startup in the automotive industry into, again, the 21st century and help them get to where they're at now. Again, there's a little bit of overlap with Designlab and where I worked when I started. So I've been a mentor for the last almost 3 years at this point. And I started off doing part-time. And I sort of took on about 2 or 3 students at the start. Then I ramped that up to 5, and then ramped that up to 10. And now I'm up to 36 at the moment, as of this December cohort that's just started. And then I get more and more as time goes on. But now I'm working full time for Designlab, and we'll sort of go through that in a minute as well. But I sort of wanted to give you a brief overview of all of those things. But let's dive in a little bit deeper into each one of these things and what I learned from each of these experiences. So my main thing at university that I sort of learned was how to sit still for more than 8 hours, how to cram, so how to get things done at the very last second. How to drink copious amounts of caffeine, cheers, without dying. That's definitely a needed thing. And how much I hate coding. That definitely became very apparent. It got it to the point where I actually chose a major that I didn't want to, that purposely didn't have coding, different levels of coding in it, so that I could graduate without learning code. That's how dispassionate I was against coding. And that later came to bite me in the butt. So I'll talk about that a bit later. And then obviously I did go there for a reason, which was learning design. So I did learn a little bit about design theory, but it was sort of somewhat a second-class citizen to all the other things that I did learn. What I did learn, however, on my first job is I learned all the skills that I probably should have learned in university. So this is the kind of stuff that you go and you look at and you realize holy crap, there's so much stuff I don't know. University didn't tell me any of this. It didn't there were some technical skills that I had to learn, which to my dread was coding eventually. Some soft skills, university definitely doesn't teach you soft skills, including how to deal with office politics, how do you deal with someone who puts tuna in the microwave, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with people disagreeing with you? You do have that a little bit, but it's not. Your livelihood doesn't depend on it. In a university setting, it's somewhat of a bubble. So you can't just say, I disagree with you and walk out of the room. You sort of have to actually deal with it. The other things that I sort of learned were some things that were specific to the actual job itself, which were the business strategy, marketing, return on investment, SEO, so search engine optimization, user experience. There's so many different things that I learned on the actual job that I should have learned in university that were just absolutely crucial. This experience taught me a whole lot. The other thing it taught me how to be was a crappy manager. So as you may remember, at university, I got a degree in or a major in IT marketing and management. But that, again, that didn't really teach me how to deal with people. That didn't really teach me how to like understand someone's problems and help them through that problem and do problem solving in that kind of way, in a very human way. So I myself had a crappy manager, so I didn't really have a good role model in that sense. So this was a very big wake up call for that. So yeah. And then what I learned being a remote designer. So I learned how to be lonely. So what I realized is that there are pros and cons to remote work. And one of the cons is you are alone a lot. Like right now, like all I've got is my Pokemon toys and a few like gaming systems right now. But I don't really have anybody to talk to. I don't have anybody to bounce ideas off of. I need to like instigate that quite a bit. I also learned how important sunshine is, like literally just fresh air and walking outside. It seems silly, but when you work remote, time actually just like stand still, because you don't realize like how many environmental triggers there are in a workplace that tell you, hey, Linda is cooking tuna in the microwave, that's lunchtime. You don't really sort of like have those cues and those triggers to know when to do certain things. So when you're locked in a room by yourself, it can be a little bit depressing. It can be a little bit bad for your mental health and for your physical health. But what it did do is it helped me to be a more effective communicator. And what I mean by that is because I was detached from everybody else, I didn't have the constant communication with everyone. I had to put in extra effort. I had to very much make sure that I was communicating effectively, both written, design, oral, like whatever kind of method of communication that I had, to make sure that it worked for everybody on the team. So I sort of had to make sure that that was an ongoing thing. I also learned how to be my own boss, which was great. But again, that's a pro and a con, I think. Like you realize again, when you're working in an office environment, that you have people walking past you all the time. You have your boss maybe walks behind you. Maybe it's not your direct upline, but it's like your boss's boss or something like that, walking past you, the CEO. There's always someone around you, like coming up behind you, and especially because a lot of designers have 27-inch iMacs, and you have like really pretty things on your screen. Everybody tends to look at your screen as they walk past. So it's one of those things where because your thing is eye candy, everybody tends to look at your screen, and therefore you can't be on Reddit, on YouTube, on Twitter, doing your own thing. So I had to be a lot more proactive in how I schedule, in how I set up my documents and my projects, and I sort of had to really, focus, put the blinders on, and be able to do that. That is really, really hard for a lot of people. What I learned at AutoGuru. So what I learned here, again, like just a brief intro to what AutoGuru does, is it essentially helps you find a mechanic in your local area, but it also does a lot more than that. So it sort of like helps you find like not the cheapest, but one based on quality and all that kind of stuff, as well as it compares the price of the job that you're wanting to do with all these different other mechanics in the local area. So you can then sort of see, okay, this is the right job that I want to do. This is the right price for me. Oh, but wait, they're only 1 star. This guy's a little bit more expensive, but he's got 5 stars, so I'll go with them, right? So it's a way to qualify and quantify how good a mechanic is, as well as we do all the little bits and pieces in between. So we sort of like something like something like fixing your car can be quite an expensive thing. So what we found is that anything over $100 to $200 is, as an unexpected expense, can throw off a family's way of living for a whole week to a month, right? So like for a lot of cars, like a $200 service is quite average. And then you might then have like a $1,500, like you need to like replace like the timing belt or something like that. Like, or you need to replace the brake pads or something like that. Something quite expensive in like the thousands of dollars, or hundreds to thousands of dollars. Those kinds of things can throw you off. So we partnered with a company called Afterpay. I think they've come to the US, but yeah, they started off. I can't remember where they started off, but they've got a huge presence in Australia. And what we did is we partnered with them to make that whole thing like worthwhile and easy. So it became a way for us to help different people in different ways, not just making, oh yeah, like we can get you a good mechanic, like sweet, we're all done. It's like, no, we want to sort of like make it easy to pay for it. We want to sort of like send you an Uber to pick you up and drop you off. We want to do all those like little bits and pieces that you don't really realize, and some of you may not realize needs to happen, because some of you may not have kids, or need to go to a 9-to-5 job, as well as like pick the kids up from soccer practice or whatever it might be, and being able to do all that and still not have a car, like that's a lot. So being able to do that all in one place, that's what Auto Guru was all about. So what I sort of learned from that experience is how much I miss remote work. So I was joking with Andrew beforehand, is that like there's a lot of things that I miss about remote work when I started to work in an office environment. There's a lot of things that I don't miss about an office environment. But what I sort of wanted to, what I sort of like learned about missing the remote work is I definitely like missed rolling out of bed and being able to start working straight away, not having to do an hour or an hour and a half commute, not having to get ready for that hour and a half commute, not parking, then walking across the street. So essentially losing about 3 to 3.5 hours of my day every single day of 5 days out of the week. So close to 15, almost 20 hours a week to just getting to my job, right? Like that's crazy. That's insane. Like that's a lot of time like wasted on something that you're making someone else rich. So I sort of like wanted to get away from that, and I definitely missed that when I was at Auto Guru. The other thing that it allowed me to do is I definitely was able to design at scale with a small team. So I created a design system with the front end developers that allowed, like in Sketch, and that allowed me to create something that was very, like, because I was the only designer on the team, that allowed me to create something that was the work of like 10 people, and be able to pump out like 15, 20 screens in a matter of seconds. So doing up a design system was a little bit of legwork at the start, but now it's essentially, as soon as we think of something, I can essentially draw up a wireframe on a piece of paper, show it to a front-end developer, and they know exactly what components to use. They know what type scale to use. They know what colors, all that kind of stuff, because we've worked together to build that thing in the first place. So it allowed us to essentially develop at the speed of thought. And that really sort of like helped that whole process when you're a very small team. It also allowed me to be a better manager. I didn't have any direct like people below me, but it was sort of like I was like a team lead for a lot of projects. So I sort of was able to talk with a whole bunch of different people, see what they're like, see what they wanted to do, and actually work with them, but be in some point of leadership role. But it allowed me to, because I had a good manager and I had good uplines from that manager, I was able to be a better manager myself. I was able to like see how they're doing that, see how I can then apply that to my way of thinking as well. And lucky last is Designlab. So how to be a better designer. Like that one seems a little bit weird because I'm teaching design. Like, how do you be like, don't I know everything about design? Like, I've been doing it for 10 years. Like, I should know everything about design. Well, yes and no, right? Like, I know like design theory, like that's pretty standard at this point. But like everything changes all the time and it's constantly evolving. And what this allows me to do is when I have a student who is like is very curious about the process, like I'm able to they're able to ask me a lot of questions, and it actually challenges me to actually come up with an answer because I've been thinking about them for the last 10 years, but I might be in auto mode. Like I might just be running like based on muscle memory rather than like actually thinking about what I'm doing, how I'm doing it, why I'm doing it, and is this the best way to do it? So having a person who's trying to become a designer say, why do you do that? Like that, like it does give me an existential crisis, of course, but it also makes me rethink what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. The other thing that I think has that Designlab has helped me in doing is it has made me a better person. Like I feel as though that like I'm able to, because I have these talks with different students, I'm able to talk to different people around the world. I'm able to understand how they feel about certain things happening in the world, how they feel about products. Like I've had people who have gone through depression. I've had people who are like colorblind. Like I've had people that are from different countries. So I get like all this like different context of like be like essentially going around the world without having to actually spend the money doing it. And that has allowed me to personally grow as well as share my experiences with others and help them personally grow. So I really love that, like back and forth. Of course, it's also showed me how to be a mentor. So that's sort of like that's not only in the sort of like technical skills kind of way, but it's also the like business skills as well as the personal growth skills, like the soft skills kind of thing, and being able to do all that. And it also has renewed my love of remote work. Oh, we lost connection for a second there, but seems like it's all good. So yeah, it's restored my love for remote work, and that allowed me to love remote work again. So I've learned from my past mistakes of not knowing what sunshine is for 8 hours a day, and being able to actually do that again. So yeah, that's sort of like my my past. But a question that I often get asked is in the present, like as of right now, I get asked this by my wife, I get asked this by my parents, my grandparents, but what do you even do? And that's kind of worrying, being in this industry for 10 years and they still don't know what I do on a daily basis, how I pay the bills. But I can't blame them. Not everybody is as excited about design as I am. And the elevator pitch that I sort of give is I build websites and apps. And some people are satisfied by that answer. They're like, "Oh yeah, cool. Like that's pretty ordinary. Like, yep, like that's a thing that like people do." And some people aren't satisfied by the answer, but like, what do you do? What do you do? So they keep going down that rabbit hole. So one of the first things that I sort of like say is like, I make crappy experiences delightful, and this is somewhat of a mantra that Jared Spool has. So if you haven't heard of Jared Spool, there's a few links at the end of this talk. You could also just like Google him. He's pretty easy to find. And he has a talk about this Kano model, where he talks about like how to meet basic expectations and all this kind of stuff. But essentially, like a good metaphor that I like to use, because I have a dog. He hasn't made an appearance yet, but he seems like he's sleeping down there. Is what if your dog craps in your house? All right. Like, to make that a delightful experience, like you could put some lavender spray on it, right? You could just like spray about it, like set and forget, and then walk away. Yep, problem solved, done. But you still have a turd in your house. You need to deal with that, right? So the first step of making a delightful experience is making it okay. So the making it okay is actually easy. So in this case, like, you just pick up the turd and deal with it, right? Like that's easy. You clean it up, like, you're done. To make it a delightful experience is a lot harder. That is a lot more tricky, and this is also where another talk by a person called Dana Chisnell, what she sort of says in her talk is, and she's got ebooks, audiobooks, like all that kind of stuff. And again, I'll link to it at the end, is that there's 3 approaches to delight, right? So 3 of them: pleasure, flow, and meaning. So what do those mean? Like, how do I make an experience delightful? How do I make it pleasurable? How do I make an experience flow? How do I make an experience meaningful? And this is like her approach to how to do that. And the first one is pleasure, right? So once we've taken care of the basic expectations. So my basic expectation in this case, in this scenario, is that my dog shouldn't be crapping in the house. Like, that's my basic expectation. So once that has been met, once the crap has been dealt with, like, how do I actually make that a pleasurable experience? Well, we can go based off of aesthetics. So these are anything. When I say pleasure, I mean anything that like tickles the 5 senses. And this happens for different people in different ways. So for me, it would be more visual and animation and all that kind of stuff. For someone like Andrew, it might be more written and like storytelling and that kind of thing driven, because his one of his like backstory is that he is a writer as well. So different people will have different levels of what they are pleasured by. So what we sort of can do there is like, we can look at like aesthetics, so pretty buttons and like awesome drop shadows. Taste, so like how things like actually taste. Like if you go to a restaurant, something that is delightful, that tastes really good, versus like something that is edible, right? So think of like a really nice Italian restaurant versus, I don't know, what is that? Like, what is it called? Olive Garden, something like that. Like, it's just edible, right? It's not the greatest. Like, you can eat it, you can digest it, but it's not the greatest Italian food ever. Same with sounds, animation, smells, interactions, and storytelling. So all of those things, the 5 different senses, like how do we make that, how do we make that good? So in this case, this is actually, again, quite easy because this is almost like adding polish to it, right? This is like adding something on top of it. Then we've got flow, which is slightly harder than pleasure. So this is like looking at things in terms of steps throughout a process. How do we make sure that by doing one thing up here, that it doesn't affect the other thing over here? How do we make sure that that process is streamlined? And this is like the ease of use, the speed at which you're able to do the task, the effectiveness of it, and so on. So, for example, like let's say that you were filling out like if you went to a doctor for the first time, and they actually have like every time that I go to a doctor, a new doctor anyway, is that I have to fill out like a 2-3 page document that says like, oh, is it Mr. or Mrs.? Is it what's your date of birth? What's your Medicare number? Blah blah blah. It like has all of those like questions, like what, like who's your closest like next of kin and all that kind of stuff. Like it has all of those questions, but again, like what if you had a system that then did that for you, or that you were able to answer one thing and then do a lookup on your name or your Medicare number that then said, oh, here's all the latest information. And it became a confirmation step rather than a write it down on a piece of paper. Then we'll like in a good way, we may in a good situation, you might OCR it, but most of the time it is someone out there like typing it manually. So in this case, we're trying to predict what they're going to do next by helping them out earlier rather than later and making them do manual steps. We're trying to make it easier throughout the process. And the hardest one of all is meaning. Oh, I keep dropping out. So hopefully that isn't affecting you guys too much. But the meaning here in this case is the values of the user are matching the values of the company or the industry. So this one is the hardest because, okay, cool. My connection is 100% fine, Andrew says. That's good. Because I think Livestorm's being a little bit overprotective and telling me that it's dropping out when it's not. What I'm trying to do with this meaning is try to match my the users, the customers that I have with the ones that I have at my brand, at my company. And this is where a lot of companies get into trouble because let's take McDonald's, for example. So McDonald's, at least in Australia, boasts about how it is like fair trade coffee, and we do this and we do that for our coffee beans, and it's all everything is we're trying to not use like plastic straws anymore and all that kind of stuff. So that kind of stuff is, of course, really great, right? Like they are trying to make a difference in the world. But at the same time, it can feel a little bit disingenuous because you sort of go, okay, well, why didn't you do that earlier on? Why did it become a thing all of a sudden when everybody else is doing it, right? If it was such an important thing to you, why haven't you done it previously? So it needs to be at what I sort of say in the slide here is it needs to be at the core of your values and the core of your mission statement. If it is at the core of your mission statement, it becomes a lot easier. So things like there's plenty of companies that are out there that do have that, and they're a lot more younger companies because they realize that's how they set themselves apart from the juggernauts that are out there. So things like there's plenty of companies out there that do you buy a pair of shoes or you buy a pair of glasses, and then that helps someone else in need. Or a company like Bellroy, I'm a big fan of theirs, is they don't necessarily have they do have some things where they're a B Corp, which means a whole bunch of things. You can look that up later on. And it also, they're trying to move all of their production of all of their things into this recycled plastic stuff that they're using. So they still use leather, they still use all this kind of stuff. So they're not like, nobody is 100% guilt-free. Like that's almost impossible until we live a lot further in the future. But they're trying their best. It's at their core. It's at like their value. Whereas if something like this was at the core of McDonald's, for example, like it would be a different story as to how they do their sort of stuff. Like they wouldn't be including fries with every meal, right? They would be including, like if their mission statement was to supply everybody with food around the world, like that would be a much different direction to where they currently are at. So meaning is the hardest one because it can feel disingenuous. It can feel like a Band-Aid solution on top rather than like it's at the core of everything. And another talk that I like to reiterate from Jared Spool is his 4 resolutions of design, and this is like a really good way for you to sort of like think about where is your design at? Like how, like, am I thinking too small? Am I thinking too big? Like what concerns am I really sort of like thinking about? So the first one is at the screen level. And we sort of like look at this as like the UI design, right? So we think about like components, we think about like buttons and inputs and typography and colors and imagery and all that kind of stuff. We think about like one single screen of an app. So that's like the first resolution. Then we zoom out again, and then we have like multiple screens connecting up to each other to then make the app or the site level resolution. So in this one, we're looking at things that are connecting all of those screens together. So something like Sketch or Figma or whatever you're into, those kinds of tools can also work at this level. So they can work at the UI as well as the sort of like app and site level of it. So then we've also got, we can also look into like wireframes, sitemaps, and user research as ways to understand how those screens connect up to each other. Then when we've got multiple applications together, we can then build an organization, right? So an organization is made up of a lot of different departments and a lot of different apps that run inside of that department, right? So if you think about like, I don't know, like a fashion, like e-commerce kind of thing, you might have a sales team, you might have a customer service team, you might have like the marketing team, the graphic design department, you might have the actual like fashion designers themselves, you might have the fashion buyers. Like you have all these different things that are all working together, but then you have like the front end facing thing, you have like the delivery, like the front facing website or the app. Then you have the back end delivery mechanism to make sure that like everything that people are buying is actually linked to like the orders and all that kind of stuff, so that the people in the distribution network can actually then send out those things to the different people. So there's all these like different things within one organization that work together. So how do you design an organization? And this sort of like helps with like user journeys and design systems and design thinking, allow us to scale this design out. Then we've got the ecosystem level. So the ecosystem level is essentially how many organizations put together. So let's say that we had that Bellroy company that I was talking about. So they make bags and accessories and all that kind of stuff, like leather wallets and all that good stuff. So their organization has a whole bunch of different applications inside of it, one of which is like their website, but then they would have a sales and marketing team and all that kind of stuff, very same sort of thing. And then but they have to work within a larger ecosystem. right? So they have to like still manufacture the items. They still have to think about like the waste that they're creating as they're manufacturing these kinds of things. So this is one of the reasons why they're looking at doing this kind of like understanding of what is actually going into their wallets and not. They're being a lot more critical about that. So this ecosystem is looking at how do different organizations that are completely separate from each other, how do those interact with each other? How does a manufacturing company work with a company like Bellroy to manufacture and create something together to then do what they need to do? How does that work with like other like companies? So Bellroy might be like working with like might do a collaboration with another bag company or another, or like a fashion label like Nike or Adidas or something like that. Like, how do they have a collaboration together, and what are Nike's values and mission statement versus what is Bellroy's, and how do they come together? How do they work together? So this ecosystem level is really sort of like business strategy, like and above. So the tools are a big question mark as to how we actually deal with that at the moment, because there's a lot of stuff that we don't quite know how to really make a really good impact on that kind of stuff just yet. So looking towards the future, I think there's two things that I like to focus on is like, where are we going like as a field, and like what tools will we be using in the future? So I think the main thing is looking at ecosystem design and beyond, because we can't really define ecosystem design even right now. We still don't know if there's like outer layers on top of that. So there could be like other things that then allow us to sort of like figure out like how do we go beyond the ecosystem? How do we go beyond that? The other thing that I like to sort of like think about is AR, VR, and voice UI. So voice user interface. So right now that is a very niche topic. And I do think that it's going to become like a staple. Like if you think about how a lot of these like educational sort of like boot camps are set up, we're like sort of set up in the way of being on the front lines a lot of the time. We're actually like very quick to add things onto it. And we still haven't really figured out like how to teach that, because it's still an evolving technology. We don't know like if it'll change next week, tomorrow, whatever else. So the only people who are really sort of like getting into that are like people like Apple, people like Google and Microsoft and so on, Amazon. The really big the really big four out of those. And then you've also got AR and VR and how that might be become more of a thing. And I think those two there as well deserve some mention. So if you don't know, AR is augmented reality, VR is virtual reality. And the difference between the two is augmented reality is that you are like in normal life, but it's augmented. So you might put a pair of glasses on, you might put a pair of headphones on, whatever else. And it's like the normal everyday world, but you have an augmented like version of that. And versus VR, which takes you away from reality, like the quote unquote real world, and then puts you into its own version of reality. So in that case, I sort of like see AR being a bigger thing. Like personally, I see AR being more of a thing because VR is sort of like, I sort of see that as more of a, either an educational entertainment sort of thing, whereas AR can be used a lot more widely. And that might be like a shallow opinion right now, but it's the only one that like we haven't really sort of like figured out what it is just yet. So I'm always open to changing my mind if it gets better. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the tools. So I always get asked this question whenever a new student comes on board. It's like, oh, what tool do you use? What tool do you use? What tool do you use? And I sort of like say that the tools don't really matter. It's it's the end result. It's the deliverable at the end of the day. So whether you use Sketch, whether you use Figma, whether you use Photoshop, whether you use Illustrator, doesn't really matter. There are tools that will make it faster. But what I sort of like to sort of say here is that we have layers of abstraction, right? So what I mean by that is back in the day when computers were becoming less of a thing that took up a whole room, they were becoming more personal computers. Those kind of computers, to run them when you first were creating them, you had to actually know how to solder. You actually had to know how to like use a terminal and that kind of thing. You had to use like the black and green screen, like all that kind of stuff. Then we had a layer of abstraction on top of that, which is the graphical user interface, or GUI. And that was like pioneered by a whole bunch of really smart people to get you out of like thinking about like text and thinking more visually, because a lot more people are more visual than they are written or spoken, like oriented. So that kind of thing allows us to get closer and closer to the speed of thought. So what I really like about how this sort of like ties into the focus, like voice UI, if you think about that, that's a layer of abstraction that does all these like crazy things in the background that you don't even see. It's like wizardry, right? Again, when it works. And then, but it's the speed of thought, right? As soon as you have it come out of your mouth, something is then happening, right? If you think about like our design tools as they stand, that simply doesn't happen, right? There's a lot of human like interaction there. So I sort of see our tools becoming like automating the quote unquote easy parts, and doing things like layout, doing things like type scales, doing things like color scales, doing all of that kind of stuff like in an instant, as well as then being able to help us like differentiate and help us like understand what users are wanting to do in a very like easy way. And our tools are very, very slow in that regard. I think I think a big step forward is something like Webflow or Squarespace. A lot of people don't like Webflow and don't like Squarespace for a lot of different reasons, mainly because it's like taking their job as a coder away or whatever it might be. But it's a layer of abstraction, right? Like you move some rectangles around, you do some stuff, and you've got a website. So a lot of this kind of stuff like is layers of abstraction, but we're getting closer to being able to say, build me a website that has this call to action, that has this kind of footer, go, right? That is the dream, right? Or even if it just does it automatically based on some key metrics. Like, I think as designers, we're going to be the ones designing that thing. We're also going to be the ones that are also evolving each step forward. So a lot of people think about that as like, oh, like I'm going to lose my job security if this happens. It's like, well, no, like we're automating at this point, we're automating the level of UI design, right? We haven't really automated the app level or the organization level or even the ecosystem level. And we still don't even know what's above that, above and beyond that. So we're only automating like one tiny sliver of that sort of thing. So yeah, here's some credits and further reading if you're so inclined into reading more about the different ways of designing, the different ways of like thinking about like future design problems. This is something that like I really, really like to get into. So if you're ever into that, you can also find me on Twitter and on my personal site, Kieran.Black. And yeah, thanks for your time.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Kieran, for taking us through that deck and for sharing your insights, kind of both from your kind of personal, professional story and also on the kind of wider design industry. Awesome. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Obviously, we've got 10 minutes left for questions because Kieran ran perfectly to time, which is awesome. We've got a few questions posted in the tab already, but feel free to like post any more thoughts that have come to you like during the talk. Like if there's anything you'd like to ask Kieran about his kind of experience as a professional, his career journey, or also like any of the things he kind of talked about in terms of like design process or the future of design, get tapping away in the question tab and we will get through as many as we can. So like just to kick off discussion, I thought I'd maybe just like follow on from where you left off, Kieran. So because I also get asked quite a few questions about, you know, what does automation mean for the future of the design industry and like particularly UX UI designers. So yeah, like one thing I've been surprised by is that in a way we haven't yet seen more automation of UI design. So like some folks on this call might be familiar with the idea of a design system, which is kind of basically where you have, you know, like a set of components and patterns which are consistent and which you apply across a whole site or a whole app. And obviously like lots of that stuff, because it's very repetitious, is ripe for automation. So the question I wanted to ask you is, you know, is there anything, or, you know, are there any areas of design that you think are going to be particularly hard to automate? You know, like is there a kind of something which is always going to be human about the design process and areas where we're always going to need humans to work?
Yeah, I think so. Like because a lot of automation can take care of quantitative measures, right? So we can sort of like see that people like this color more than this color, right? So you can sort of like put up an A/B test. So having two versions of the same design and sort of like say, oh, did people click on the red button or did people click on the blue button? And that could be one of those things where you sort of go, okay, well, the blue button performed better, therefore the blue button is superior, and so on. And yeah, technically a computer could deduce that and come to that, but we don't really understand why they why they clicked on that blue button, right? It could be that the blue button actually stood out more, right, based on the rest of the thing. It could be that the red button in Western culture is sort of seen as a delete button, and like a destructive action. There's all these different things that could possibly come up. And like I sort of said, like even if we are automating the UI side of things, someone has to make all of those rules and we all have to agree on what those rules are to then automate it, which is very, very far away. Like I don't see that becoming a thing straight away. But what I do like about this is having having this kind of discussion leads us to why we think we need to keep reinventing the wheel. Like why we think we need to keep reinventing like how big a button is, like what size it should be, like how many pixels rounded it should be, all that kind of stuff. I do think like system design, or design systems, I should say, is should take care of those kinds of things so that it like alleviates our problems, alleviates the smaller problems for us to focus on the bigger and better problems above and beyond. So, like again, like I sort of said, like the if we were to automate those things, that we just focus on the next level up, and then we focus on the next level up. And so long as there's humans in there, I think there's still going to be a level of human psychology, and understanding of the human condition as to how we might do that. So I think it's more the qualitative side that we don't really understand, and we would have to write some insane algorithm to predict that, to predict human behavior. Like we can predict like overall human behavior, based on certain like aspects and demographics and all that kind of stuff. But an individual person is so individual that it makes it hard for us to see what they're going to want to do there. We can be generalistic, but I do think that there is always going to be some sort of level of human interaction when it comes to the design process. I don't think we could be completely removed from that.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. You heard it here first, folks. Like, there's always going to be a design industry because we. Well, I mean,
and if there's not, you can blame Kieran. Apparently,
I always tend to think, we like often at the beginning of learning about design, we tend to think of it as kind of very visual or whatever. But really, like, I think design is about creative problem solving, and there are like no shortage of problems in the world to be solved, right? And so many of those problems are human centered, and we're going to need like people to understand them. Is kind of my thoughts on it. Anyway, I should stop taking up the time with my dumb questions, and we should take some questions from our esteemed audience. So I'm going to go for Caitlin's question first because it's got the most upvotes. So Caitlin asks, I've been working remotely for 4 years in another field, and I'm in the process of switching careers to design. Ideally, I'd like to work remotely in this field, but I've had mixed reviews when initially breaking into the field. So I'd love to hear Kieran's take on new designers working remotely. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. So because you've got experience working remotely, that's a little bit different. I would sort of say that working remotely as a designer when you first start out is actually very, very hard. Because when you're first there, you need that sort of like team dynamic. You need to understand how people think, how people work. Like you need to have develop those interpersonal skills and all that kind of stuff. The soft skills, like I was talking about. That kind of thing actually becomes really, really hard to do when you're working remotely for the first time. So that's if you had no remote experience previously. Because you have remote experience, I think you're going to have those interpersonal skills like slightly leveled up more than like most remote workers. But it also, you are learning a new skill. So that's something to take into consideration. You are learning something for the first time, and sometimes being around other people is actually like a really good kickstart to how you might get into the industry. What I usually sort of say to my students is that you're getting it from one, you're going through this UX Academy sort of course, and you're working with a white cisgender male who is almost 30, and that is has no kids, grew up upper middle class. You're getting a very specific way of thinking about it, a way of understanding the world and understanding the design culture and all that kind of stuff. And not to mention I'm from Australia, so there's that whole thing. Depending on where you work remotely, depending on the culture, depending on how you work with other designers, there's so many different variables in that. What I would suggest is sign up. If you are trying to work remotely, maybe it's one of those things where you can work for someone for maybe 6 months or a year, and then say, look, I want to work remotely, or find a completely different job. I would sort of use that first 6 months to a year to sort of understand, because again, very, very similar to my university experience, I learned so much in my first job that I didn't learn in university. And it's the same sort of thing in UX Academy, is that we can't teach you everything. We can't teach you office politics. We can't teach you what the business model of the business that you're going into, because we don't know what business you're going to go into, right? There's so many different things that you would need that you can only learn on the job, that it's hard for me to recommend as a junior designer in your first 6 months or first year to go remote. Going freelance is a different thing. Like going freelance is like you meeting up with a client and doing that kind of thing, and physically seeing them. But going remote, working for another company that you don't really get to be in contact with, that's different. So yeah, hopefully that answered your question in some sort of way. I know it was a bit of a roundabout, but there's so many different variables, and it'll depend on your own personal situation. But I do think that working with a team first is a really good way for you to understand like how like design sprints work, how agile works, how all this kind of stuff works in context. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, feel free to write in, Caitlin, or indeed anyone else. Like if you'd like to follow up about any of these questions and like discuss further with our team, you can email hello@trydesignlab.com. We'd be like delighted to talk some more. We are overrunning by a few minutes, but that's okay. Like if anyone needs to go, like feel free to hop off. Obviously, we'll have a video of this session available. But we'll press on and just get through the last couple of questions since we've just got a couple more to do. So this is a bit specific, but I think it would be interesting to talk about it. So we've got a question from Yui who asks, it might be a little irrelevant, but I'm actually based in Brisbane, Gold Coast, and I'm really interested to hear your opinion about the design scene or industry here, for example, about getting a job here. I suppose like if you have any thoughts, Kieran, as well, we could also like broaden this question out a little and just, you know, if you've got any general tips on on exploring the kind of local job market for people first going into UX.
Yeah, for sure. So for people who are unfamiliar with Brisbane and Gold Coast, so Brisbane is a capital city of one of the biggest states in Australia, and Gold Coast is a regional city based off of like, and that's where I am. From it's about an hour or so away from Brisbane, and like the center of the Gold Coast is anyway. And yeah, so we're sort of like one town away from Brisbane, and there's like a middle. There's a city in between that nobody really likes to talk about called Logan, and that sort of it's like a halfway city that nobody really lives in. They either like live there to work in Brisbane, or they live there to work in Gold Coast, and yeah, so. Specifically the Gold Coast, and specifically like what I'll probably talk to as a to your point, Andrew, to broaden this out is how do I get a job in a non-capital city? And this kind of thing is very hard because non-capital cities tend to not have that many jobs available. Specifically in the Gold Coast, there's probably only about like 5, maybe 10 companies that I would sort of say are sort of like product like oriented, like they are sort of like startups and that kind of thing. There are a few of them, like there are like, but it's essentially just doing your homework, seeing what is actually out there. So even simply just typing in Gold Coast startup, seeing what's available, looking at your local, like what I like to sort of like say is don't put all your eggs in one basket. So look at LinkedIn. LinkedIn, as creepy and as gross as that platform is, it actually is worth looking into. So looking into LinkedIn, looking at their job market, seeing what's actually there, seeing what companies are actually based on the Gold Coast or whatever region that you're in, if you're not in a capital city, seeing what's around there. So there are different types of companies, right? There's like startups, there's agencies like digital agencies need designers all the time because they chop and change and they do all that kind of stuff. There's companies that have been around forever that don't realize that they need a UX designer as well. So yeah, look at the local job market. Look at whether that's LinkedIn, whether that's like Indeed or Seek in Australia, like whatever it might be. The other thing is go to meetups. Like definitely start like figuring out who are your people in your city, who are your people in your area. because there's a site called meetups.com. Hopefully it's not like meetup.com. Let me just quickly, so you don't go to some weird dating site. Meetups.com.
I think it's meetup.com. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah, sweet. So something like that. Again, it is very US centric, but there are some, again, like other countries in there that do use that platform. And what that allows us to do is meet up with people that are similar to us, that are interested in the same things as us. So find your community in that area. The other sort of like part to this is reaching out to recruiters. Again, like I have like some of my best friends are recruiters, right? Like that kind of thing is like some people think they're like a subhuman, and then some people absolutely love recruiters because some recruiters give other recruiters bad names. But it depends on like the kinds of companies that you can sort of like look into. So specifically for UE in Gold Coast, Brisbane area, I'd look up BlackRock. BlackRock without the last K, so BlackRoc, and then also Just Digital People. Those are two both recruiting agencies that I've worked with personally, and that I have gotten jobs from, and all that kind of stuff. There's plenty of recruiters out there. So again, look at LinkedIn, set up your LinkedIn profile properly, so that it does look good for a recruiter to contact you, and you to contact them, and so on. So yeah, just get an understanding of like what your local area is like. And like I said, it's different for everybody. But if you're in a regional city like I am, you're not really in a capital city, it can be a little bit harder. So obviously, the closer you are to a capital city, the easier it's going to be, for sure. But like I said, there's freelance opportunities, there's remote opportunities, there's all different types of ways to get a design job.
Yeah, totally echo that. And yeah, you can usually search on meetup.com like specifically for UX meetups, for example, and that'll often, even if you don't, immediately connect with opportunities through that, it allows you to build your network and just kind of find out what's out there. One other thing you might want to look into if you're in a big city is creative mornings. So these are like basically early morning meetups where you go and listen to a talk from people in a creative industry, and that can be another way of networking. Awesome. Okay, we will wrap up with a final question from Julie. So Julie's asking about design tools, and she asks, with all that being said about tools not mattering, do you have any preferred ways of prototyping that maybe get us closer to the speed of thought? So yeah, basically, like,
sneak it in there.
How can we prototype more quickly?
Yeah. It depends on what level of fidelity that you're looking for, right? So what I like to sort of like think about is, what kind of prototype does the user need? What kind of prototype does this person need versus that person? Like, how can I make it something that like both answers my question, but also works for that kind of user? So someone who is really familiar with the product, I could probably just do some like wireframes, right? I could do some wireframes and sort of say like, oh yeah, this goes to here, this goes to there, and you use something like as part of the UXA course, we talk about Marvel, where you just sort of like snap photos of like the screens like on a piece of paper, and then you're able to then like drag and drop like little arrows to each other to sort of say like, oh, this one goes to here, this one goes to here, when you tap on this sort of like rectangle, right? So that allows you to very, very quickly, again, like get to the point of speed of thought. It's not quite there, but it's a stepping stone. I think it's a step in the right direction of being able to draw something on a piece of paper or draw something on a whiteboard, snap, 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 then draw up the connections. Like that to me is like very, very close to what I want to happen, but it's, again, not quite there, but it's definitely getting closer. I can do like coding prototypes. Like I use a thing called codepen.io, which is sort of like a way to do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And for some of my students, like I take them through like how you can like set up a dev environment very, very quickly and prototype in that. You could prototype in Webflow. Webflow, like if you haven't used it before, is essentially like a better version of Squarespace. And it's sort of like a mixture of learning coding concepts without actually learning the syntax of code, right? So you don't actually have to know like, how do I make a background red, right? Or the text blue or whatever. You essentially just, like very much like in Sketch or Figma, you select the item on the canvas and go over to the right-hand side of the properties panel, and you click on the background attribute and you change it to red, right? It's very, very simple like that. So, but what happens is that you're able to then actually export that out as code and use that as like a very basic prototype. I actually use my portfolio on that, and am able to do that. And it allows me to like create what I need to create. I've had people like, I'm a big fan of Notion, which is like a note-taking app. I've had people like create prototypes in that because it allowed them to do up a mental model of how a user is thinking and then be able to do some like basic linking between pages and sort of say like, oh, when they go from this page to that page, that becomes a thing. Like that's the way that I want the user to go through, right? So your imagination really is the only thing holding you back as to how you prototype. But yeah, the closest thing that I think we have right now is whatever is like, I think the closest thing actually is Marvel, as low tech as that is, like as lo-fi as that is, like that's the closest thing to the speed of thought, because there's only like there's a pen and a paper. So that's one level of abstraction. Then there's like the taking of the photos as a second level. And then you've got the third level of actually like wiring them up. Right. So a lot of those things, like, so if that's only 3 levels deep, like we sort of like think about like doing up something in Sketch or Figma, then translating that to a prototype and all that kind of stuff. We had to do so many steps to get it even into Sketch or into Figma itself. So I find that, yeah, wireframing with pen and paper and then doing something like that is the closest that we have in terms of speed of thought right now, anyway.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Julie. Thanks, Kieran, for the answer. I'm just going to post a link here as well to an article that was on our blog last year, I think, by another awesome Designlab mentor called Sangeeta Balasubramani. And this kind of introduces sort of some tips to rapid prototyping, but also how prototyping can fit into the design sprint process. But yeah, I think we've covered all our questions. So thanks everyone for posting those. If you do want to follow up at all and ask us any more questions or like ask us to expand on anything that Kieran said, please, as I said, just email hello@trydesignlab.com and we will get back to you. But other than that, thanks so much to Kieran for joining us and for leading this session. And thank you everyone for joining and for your questions. And we hope you have happy holidays.
Thanks so much, everybody. See you later.
Awesome. Bye for now, everyone.